Brilliant. Thanks very much, everyone, especially Alex for bringing us all together, and to the other presenters for their papers. Yeah, it's really lovely to be here, a real treat. So I'm presenting a paper currently called The Limits of Rebellion, though the title has changed every time I've given it. That is an attempt to think about the symbolic power of the idea of rebellion in liberal capitalist societies, and the implications of that symbolic power for radical politics. So on the one hand, I think rebellion is a kind of like often used and important signifier for radical politics. It kind of evokes a kind of an aesthetic and an intellectual and a libidinal register for the refusal of existing conditions, the overturning of the world as we find it and encounter it. But on the other hand, I think rebellion is quite intimately folded into liberalism. And in that context, it's pacified, it's commodified, and it's increasingly embraced by reactionary politics. And so what I'm trying to do in this paper is think about that folding of rebellion into kind of liberal and reactionary politics, and then to think about what the pathways through that might be for a more kind of radical political imagination. Does this work? That sign should have been playing while I introduced that. Here we go, Extinction Rebellion. So the paper is going to begin with Extinction Rebellion, take a tour through Extinction Rebellion, talk about liberalism and the way that liberalism is kind of rebellion is folded into liberalism. I'm going to show you a video of Liz Truss just to kind of flag that up front for those of a nervous disposition. And then towards the end, I'll move on to what I think is a kind of a more radical pathway through some of this. So I'm beginning with Extinction Rebellion because they have been the most significant, the most prominent, and in many ways the most successful kind of mobilizers of the subject position and the aesthetics of rebellion in recent years. The kind of the notion that one needs to be a rebel, that one should rebel, and that kind of rebellion is the kind of appropriate and powerful framing for radical politics has been something that Extinction Rebellion have put right at the front of their campaign and mobilized in ways that I think are very problematic, as I'm going to go on and say, but on their own terms have been very successful. Few other movements have got as many people onto the streets as regularly as Extinction Rebellion have over the last few years. And I think even as there's a lot of, I think, well-founded criticism of Extinction Rebellion, on their own terms, they've been immensely successful in that respect. And I think the kind of the idea and the mobilization and the kind of intellectual, political, aesthetic register of rebellion has been really central to that. So, you know, if you go onto their website, you can do a quiz of what kind of rebel are you. You can go to the Rebel Academy. You've got memes like Rebel for Life. You know, this idea is really central to their strategy and their politics. And that really is kind of rooted in the basic theory of change that Extinction Rebellion hold. They've drawn heavily from Chenoweth and Stevens' kind of work on civil resistance, and kind of drawn from this, the kind of, I think, slightly mishandled conclusion from that work, that kind of rebellions that achieve a certain participation rate from the population tend to be successful. You can see that in the image that's here. Historical evidence shows that we need the involvement of 3.5% of the population to succeed. So this is kind of drawing of a conclusion of a kind of mass quantitative study of civil resistance that says that when movements attain a kind of particular quantity and mass within society, they tend to be successful, and kind of turning in that into a simplification that kind of is irksome as a social scientist, but very powerful as social discourse, to say if enough people get involved and rebel, we will win. You know, that's become a very powerful narrative. It's been very successful at mobilizing people to take action. There are, I think, two important critiques of this that have been widely made, like this isn't me making them. The first is that what we're seeing here is a kind of a fetishization of transgression, right? A kind of quite simplistic causal logic that says, if enough people break the law, then the political change they want will happen. Okay, so an emptying out of some of like the particular social and political contexts, the particular decisions about what laws are broken and when and how, to come up with something a bit more straightforward, which is enough people breaking the law and getting arrested will lead to political change, will lead to the kind of social pressure that is needed. So that's quite a simplistic causal logic, but there are kind of some deeper problems that attend to that. One is that Extinction Rebellion has been widely criticized for providing only very limited support to people who are actually breaking the law. You know, the legal support, the legal advice, the guidance through the court system that they've provided to people who have been arrested has often been quite shoddy, and this has gone alongside a very apolitical and problematic account of the role of the police within the context of social protest. But more importantly, I think, is that this is a kind of mode and a way of thinking about rebellion, the promotion of mass arrests, that's inaccessible to many people, especially those without citizenship, people of color, people with disabilities, for whom exposure to arrests carries far more significant risks. It's been interesting over the last year or so. There's been some attempt to shift this within Extinction Rebellion to bring in more diverse ranges of people, to expand what it means to be a rebel in the context of Extinction Rebellion. But those shifts have been quite limited, and I think that's because those basic foundations aren't particularly strong. And so the attempt to kind of retcon a more inclusive version of resistance have been quite, they've had significant limits. So you've got this fetishization of transgression. If you break the law, then things change for the better. But you've also got a fetishization of liberalism. So despite Extinction Rebellion's claim to be non-political, that avowed non-politicality resolves into very liberal demands. The demands for citizens' juries, the demand for the government to tell the truth. And more specifically, the strategic role of rebellion in Extinction Rebellion's vision is a very liberal one. It's civil disobedience mobilized to pressure the government into changing its course. It's a fundamentally liberal mode of social action. Importantly, that kind of liberal mode of action is dependent on the understanding that your actions will be recognized as political, that your rebellion will be recognized as a political rebellion. That's not something that everyone can take for granted. And so who gets to count as political, whereas who gets to count as kind of merely criminal, for example, is something that's kind of stepped around in Extinction Rebellion's framework. So what we then get in that fetishization of transgression and that fetishization of liberalism is rebellion being tamed into an act of liberal citizenship. I think that's one of the fundamental problems of what Extinction Rebellion have done. The problems of Extinction Rebellion here reveal, I think, a deeper tension in the idea of rebellion. And that's related to the very fundamental but ambiguous role that rebellion has within liberalism. So on the one hand, rebellion against unjust authority is one of the founding myths of liberalism. Liberalism absolutely depends on the notion that it is just and right and necessary to kind of rebel against unjust authority. And the founding stories, whether they're theoretical stories as we find in Locke and elsewhere, or whether they're in accounts of the French and American revolutions within the kind of constitution of liberalism, liberalism needs rebellion. It needs the myth and the idea, the possibility and the sometimes justness of rebellion. And within a liberal society, the claim to be rebelling against unjust authority is a powerful way of claiming legitimacy. You know, it's a very powerful kind of way of justifying what you're doing, is to say, well, there's an unjust authority and I'm rebelling against it. It's a good way of justifying yourself, but also naming something else as harmful. So liberalism needs rebellion, but rebellion is also a perennial problem for liberalism, a cause of social upheaval, a threat to the social order, a threat to markets. So rebellion has to be permitted but carefully managed. And that tension is kind of one, I think you can tell quite a lot of the history of liberalism through the kind of need to manage that tension and occasional failures to manage that tension. It's in those contexts of the ambiguous role of rebellion within liberalism that we can look at other kind of significant mobilizations of rebellion that are kind of prominent at the moment, and kind of situate all of these as kind of part of this liberal tension. A very prominent one right now is the right wing's kind of self-identity as a kind of rebellious force. I'm going to show you a video that's got less funny every time I've shown it, and now feels really quite uncomfortable. And this is a short excerpt from Liz Truss's famous speech to the 2014 Conservative Party conference.
Conference. I have to confess, that I was both delighted and surprised when the Prime Minister appointed me in this role. I was delighted because I love the countryside. I represent one of the most productive agricultural areas of the country in the fine county of Norfolk. I see some of them in the audience, and I am infatuated with British food. But I was surprised to be appointed because of what I have in common with Ed Miliband. We both grew up in left-wing households. We both have parents who are academics. His father talked about Marx and Trotsky over the dinner table. My mother took me on protests. I went on marches. I made banners. I stayed at peace camps. For me, it wasn't ballet or My Little Pony. It was saving the planet and the CND. The most useful thing I learned was how to make myself heard in a crowd. And I haven't forgotten that lesson to this day. But while Ed stayed with the predictable left-wing establishment, I, conference, rebelled. I became a conservative. And there are three reasons I rebelled. I believed that we can shape our own destiny. I believe that people should succeed on merit. And as a practical Yorkshire girl, I believe that rather than talking, we should be about getting things done.
Okay, that's enough of that. So at once, Truss trades on the aesthetic and the rhetorical purchase of being a rebel, while also situating progressive or left-wing politics, supposedly rebellious politics, as in fact sites of hegemony against which freethinkers must rebel. And that move by right-wing politicians, intellectuals, activists has become really common. And is very powerful. It allows them to cast the apparently liberatory promises of left-wing politics as in fact sites of coercive authority and oppression, while of course obscuring their own role in maintaining oppressive systems of power. The obvious and the most common response to these kinds of infuriating proclamations is to point out that Liz Truss is obviously not a rebel, that Nigel Farage is not a free thinker, that Toby Young is not leading a resistance against coercive authority. You know, it's very kind of tempting and I think necessary and important to refuse to permit that discursive, intellectual and libidinal occupation of the conceptual architecture of political liberation. To identify the glaring hypocrisies and cynical inversions required to position English nativism and white supremacy and free market ideology as subversive of rather than integral to global power relations. But while that kind of response, that pointing out of the hypocrisy is necessary, it also risks obscuring the ways that these kind of strange constructions do reveal those deeper tensions within the kind of political register of rebellion as it relates to liberalism. Like, I don't think we can dismiss right-wing mobilizations of rebellion as entirely cynical. They do have content, right? They're tied to a particular kind of hegemonic masculinity. They're tied to a kind of a sense of the settler colonial frontier, this like Promethean impulse to refuse to be constrained by the rules governing masses. Wait, where's this image? I like this one. This is that classic Economist front page. You know, the rebel has power as a figure of bourgeois freedom, and in mobilizing it, Truss is kind of tapping into a kind of a significant strain in kind of the idea of what it means to be a rebel. while that figuration is really unpalatable, it's nevertheless coherent and has force as a kind of felt vital experience. It's affecting. And so within a liberal framework, Truss's claim to be a rebel makes some kind of perverse sense. Another really prominent trend, as well as this, occupation of rebellion by the right, is the kind of the commodification of rebellion. So from the 60s onwards, the image and the aesthetics of rebellion have become a staple of popular culture and commodification. Through products, fashion, music, film, television, the rebel has become a kind of major commodity item. And much of that commodification links the image of the rebel with sort of hyper-individualism, the figure who doesn't have to play by anyone else's rules. And so this here is the Honda rebel, which, as I used to be cynical, I also like at thinking maybe that's my next bike. While the commodity of the rebel grew to popularity during the massive social upheavals of the 1960s, it's generally abstracted from those politics. And it has longer histories in the frontier, the colonial explorer, while foreshadowing kind of 1980s neoliberalism. And it is, of course, a figure that's heavily associated with masculinity, the brooding man who gets the job done, the rebel without a cause. That's been updated in recent times. You get the commodification of a more kind of woke rebellion that kind of trades on contemporary radical signifiers, but reduces these to a very crude identitarianism, a very depoliticizing mode of rebellion, but it sells. And there are some interesting ways in which radical movements themselves get pulled into this form of this process of commodification. So the images of rebellion that are frequently produced within movements are very easily recuperated, repackaged, made consumable in ways that can pacify their radical content. And I think there might be an interesting digression on Banksy that can be made there. So to skip forwards, because I'm running out of time, if rebellion is a mode of liberal citizenship and bourgeois freedom, what space is left for radical politics? There's a kind of sensible response to this, which is to say, well, yeah, there's too much focus on rebellion. Rebellion is kind of too easily resolved into these paradoxes, too easily a discourse for heroes and martyrs, too easily recuperated or co-opted. And so from this perspective, while more radical politics do involve a kind of tradition and aesthetics of rebellion, think of the Zapatistas, for example, this is maybe better viewed as a byproduct. Only the content makes something radical. And so that more kind of sensible approach would then say the focus should be on like mutual aid, prefiguration, construction, what can we build? What is built in this moment? And there's a lot that's really true and important and valuable and necessary about thinking about what is constructive in the process of rebellion. But I think there's a danger that that approach also too easily discards the subjective labor and the aesthetic power that goes into and emerges from social and political action that breaks the rules, that refuses to participate with or collaborate in an oppressive system. Radical politics needs rebellion, disobedience, naughtiness, transgression, even as it needs not to be reducible to these. In trying to think about how we might find some pathways through that, I'm increasingly interested, or particularly interested, in the concepts that are emerging in Black radical thought on these things. In part, Black feminist work on fugitivity, but I'm going to talk in more detail about Saidiya Hartman's work on waywardness, in which she tries to theorize refusal and revolt and rebellion from the perspective of those who are sort of a priori excluded from politics. So in her book, Wayward Lives, Hartman charts the lives of young Black women living in the Northeastern United States at the turn of the 20th century, exploring their rebellious, wayward lives, largely forgotten by history, but that nevertheless show creative, joyful, radical experiments in life in the face of a political and social system that had no interest in permitting their full humanity. And so Hartman tells us about young women in Harlem defying vagrancy laws and drinking and dancing and loving and fucking in spite of a social system that was designed to criminalize such dangerous expressions of humanity. Hartman points out that dominant intellectual and radical currents of the day ignored these practices of freedom enacted by young Black women, viewing them as non-political, non-strategic, as petty acts rather than meaningful insurrection. But Hartman looks at dances, at the erotic life of tower blocks, at prison riots, and identifies here the struggle to be free, to insist on full humanity, and to form communities of mutual aid. In these contexts, the refusal to be governed, rather than appeals to government or the desire to govern, is the radical foundation of rebellion. And those who know it best are those for whom that refusal is a condition of possibility of political action, for whom government means exclusion from the terrain of political, social, and oftentimes actual life. Notably, I think thinking with Hartman and this conceptual register gives us a vocabulary that locates the possibility of rebellion in those communities and sensibilities and subject positions who are excluded from Extinction Rebellion's politics. It focuses our attention on those whose rebellion is rooted in their status as non-political, precisely because their challenge is to the very foundation of politics. And so Hartman and others in her tradition push us to think about rebellion not through endless disputes about strategic interventions into policy or through discussions about the collected limits for rebellious activity, but as a practice of possibility, the possibility of recoding of politics and political subjectivity, to think about rebellion as interventions into the fabric of the human and refusals of dehumanization. There, I think we get a way of thinking about rebellion that doesn't so easily resolve into liberal citizenship, and that holds the possibility of generating strategies for resisting in a world predicated on the idea that certain people aren't supposed to survive. That's me. Thank you.